All right. So, gosh, here we are, 6 weeks. Time flies. And I want to begin this evening by thanking you all for being part of this series on racism in America. As together we've explored our country's history, much of which we did not learn in school. As we've seen during our time together, much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional economic and public policy and cultural beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Now that we more deeply understand the history of our country and the myriad ways that bigotry and discrimination are embedded in our society, we turn our attention this evening to the question, so what are we going to do about it? We have seen much about our country's history in these weeks together that cry out for action, for reform. Much of the historic economic discrimination will take decades or longer to address in comprehensive ways. But we have it within our ability to take meaningful action on issues of criminal justice and voting rights, alleviating poverty, and addressing inequity in education. It is essential that we do this, that we make our voices heard so that they may be heard as well. And there is another aspect of action that is less concrete, but equally important, one that addresses our personal beliefs that are based on our individual histories, our families, our education, our experiences. Examining those beliefs, surfacing what is called unconscious bias, implicit bias, is an important step in our ability to identify and counter racism in its many manifestations. Our class this evening will take what we have learned and use it as a catalyst for action. I have some thoughts to share with you this evening, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives as we engage in a meaningful path forward to a more just and equitable society. Together, we will look ahead to use our deeper understanding of our country's history to shape our future actions as we indeed seek justice and peace for all. So we'll begin with a review of our class last week, voter suppression then and now. My apologies to you. I sent out the link to that video before I had actually finished the YouTube posting, which meant that it was recorded as private and you wouldn't have been able to access it. One of you let me know that you hadn't been able to access it, so I did go in and fix it. So that link that I sent you will work if you tried to use it before. It should function at this point. So last week, we looked at a full legal history of voting rights going back to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and all of its amendments, along with various legislative acts and Supreme Court decisions. My goodness, what power the Supreme Court has had to shape our history in this area in particular. We looked at the 15th Amendment, which Congress had hoped would settle once and for all the rights of African Americans to vote. And we saw how the end of Reconstruction impacted the efforts made to provide citizenship and rights for those who had been owned as slaves. And what followed were 100 years of voter suppression tactics of African Americans. At the end of that period of time, as a consequence of the powerful civil rights movement in the United States, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, and it ushered in almost 50 years of voting rights for African Americans, where states were prevented from passing voter suppression laws. But that came to an end in 2013 with the Supreme Court decision known as Shelby County v. Holder. And what we have seen since is the profusion of voter ID laws, voting roll purges, limiting resources, all of the ways in which states could find paths to suppressing the votes of people they didn't want to have heard. And I think we asked the question last week, if indeed the authority of a government comes from the consent of the governed, which is what our Declaration of Independence says, then what indeed should be the role of government? To facilitate voting so that all have the right to give their consent to be governed, or is it to constrain voting so that only certain voices are heard? And that is the point of conflict. And as we know, the assault is accelerating. And every time I give this class, I say just this week, there was a action taken in Georgia to require the hand counting of all ballots in the upcoming election. The court said that it was too close to the election, that law could not be implemented before the votes would be counted and taken this year. And the state had not put into place any mechanisms to make the hand counting possible. So the judicial system is still serving as something of a check on the attempts of states to impact the vote, but it is always an after the fact action. Unlike the Voting Rights Act, which preemptively kept states from passing laws like that. So we will see. Taking a look back at our time together, we began with the early years, 1619 to 1865. And then the period of time called slavery by another name that included Reconstruction, the passage of Black codes, laws that only applied to Black people in our country that resulted in their mass incarceration, the institution of convict leasing, and then the Jim Crow period that resulted in the virtually total segregation of Black and white people in our country, enforced by horrific violence. We moved into the 20th century in week 3 and looked at various elements of public policy, and then the key events and achievements of the civil rights movement. Our 4th week, we focused on the criminal justice system, the next phase in mass incarceration, largely due to the focus on the war on drugs, where the prison population increased by an order of magnitude from 200,000 to 2.3 million people, with at any point in time 7 million people under the control of the criminal justice system in our country, with a disproportionate impact on people of color. And last week, of course, we looked at voter suppression from the beginning, then and now. And this week, we ask ourselves, where do we go from here? I'll begin by revisiting a couple of definitions that we used in our very first class. Prejudice is an unfavorable opinion that is formed without personal knowledge. And this is the greatest consequence of segregation in our country, because we lived separately from one another, Black and white, and were unable or did not develop personal relationships where we came to know each other as human beings. And without that personal knowledge, what rushes in to fill the gap, as nature abhors a vacuum, is stereotypes, and we see those everywhere. White supremacy is intentional. It is punitive. It says that being white is the default. It is the accepted state. The belief, conscious, active, unconscious, inactive, that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial groups, especially Black people, and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in any society. It sort of goes without saying. Racism is that discrimination directed against a group of people based on their membership in a specific racial or ethnic group. And it is not just beliefs or words or individual actions. Racism is actually a system of prejudice enforced by power. And that is clearly what we have seen throughout the course of our country's history up till today. So we'll shift our attention now from our history to the future and use our deeper understanding of our past, of how we got where we are today, to be able to shape our future actions. And so we ask ourselves, what have we learned during this time together? How are we affected by that which we now know? And how are we different? What do we see differently than we did before? So if we now can readily observe a pattern of white supremacy, of discrimination, what do we need to do individually or in collaboration with other people? And might we feel a new urgency to act to correct some of these profound inequities? So what have we learned? We learned that the institution of slavery from 1619 to 1865 created and sustained an underclass of people to an extent that they weren't even considered people in some regards. This institution, this economic system, this way of being, of treating people, necessitated a belief in Black inferiority. And when the institution of slavery ended, the belief did not. It carried through, and that's the impact that we have seen. We understand that segregation existed as law until 1964. That is not that long ago. And its legacy remains. It is still significant and embodied and perpetuated in that system of segregation is the belief and the power of white supremacy. Because we talk about separate but equal, and separate for sure, and if not equal, white was always superior, is. We looked at intentional public policy in housing, education, benefits, jobs, the criminal justice system, voting rights that systematically disadvantaged Black people throughout our history. And therefore, as a consequence of all of this, the roots of today's inequality are deeply embedded in our society. So how does knowing this history affect us? I think we all would say there is so much that we never knew, that we didn't understand. And we should probably ask ourselves, why not? Why did we not know this? Well, it's fair to say that overwhelmingly we were not taught. And yet at the same time, to some degree, we've all accepted the status quo as the way things are. And at various points in our individual history, in our communities, we've begun to ask some of the questions about what's going on and why is it like this and why are things so unfair? But that legacy of segregation created an isolation from one another in all aspects of social relationships, especially housing. And so most people in the United States today live in segregated housing areas. They're not required by law. They have evolved from law, and they have been perpetuated in many instances through habit. Recent studies have shown that approximately 75% of adult white Americans do not have a single close Black friend. And so what does that say about how well we know each other? And this separation produces a lack of understanding, certainly a lack of empathy. I would say it is difficult, if not impossible, for a white person in the United States to know what it's like to be Black in America. We may hear stories, we may see examples, but to really know it is virtually impossible. And so if we don't know each other, these stereotypes flourish. And beyond question, our media intensifies these beliefs, both overt and subliminal messaging. And we're going to talk about that. 40 years ago, I took a class offered by the DuPont Company, was called Developing Effective Black-White Relationships. And I was one of 20 white managers selected to participate in this pilot class that was facilitated by 2 Black men consultants from San Francisco. In addition, they included 2 Black DuPonters, one from each of 2 Southern manufacturing plants in DuPont. Why did they come from the plants in DuPont? Well, in part, there were precious few Black employees at the headquarters in Wilmington. But there was also a set of behaviors and accepted means of performance in Wilmington, Delaware, that were not necessarily true at the manufacturing plants. And so the facilitators explained to us that these 2 brave DuPonters from the plants had volunteered or had agreed to participate in the class for a particular purpose, to share their experiences, but to also serve as a gut check, if you will, that when the facilitators led us toward a deeper understanding of the issues that were getting in the way of these effective Black-white relationships, that we white managers would be tempted to say, well, that may be true elsewhere, but not at DuPont. And the plant employees were there to say, if appropriate, yes, at DuPont. And the facilitators, as they started this class, were looking at the 20 white managers who we probably looked like deer in the headlights. Why were we selected for this class? Was it because we were clearly such tolerant, rational, thoughtful, helpful people, or because we were a major part of the problem? It was a little bit of anxiety associated with this. And as the facilitators began the class, they said, it is important that you realize that you cannot have grown up in the United States of America in the 20th century and not be prejudiced against Black people. As white people in particular, you cannot have grown up in this country in the 20th century and not be prejudiced. So let's just not have any, I see everybody the same. I don't care if you're white, green, purple, black, white. It's irrelevant to the conversation. You cannot have grown up here and not have absorbed messaging. So here's an example. This is a bar chart, and it is contrasting in New York City in 2014, as it turns out. The delta between TV news crime reports and NYPD data. Now, we already know from our class 2 weeks ago that the criminal justice system treats Black people unfairly. We've heard the statistics about stops and frisks and arrests and charges. That being said, the NYPD data is the blue bars, and it's looking at three categories of crimes: murder, theft, and assault. In the case of murder, 54% of murders, people arrested for murder, not charged, not convicted, 54% of the people arrested for murder were Black. But the news reports showed Black suspects of committing murder 74% of the time. In the case of theft, 55% who were arrested on suspicion of theft were Black, but the news reports showed Black people 84% of the time when they were describing thefts. And in the case of assault, 49% and 73%. I was struck recently, there was a webinar offered on how to avoid being carjacked. And there was an advertisement for you to sign up for either in person or Zoom, how to prevent being carjacked. And there was an ominous image of a carjacker. And the carjacker could have been white, could have been Black, could have been brown. And the carjacker in the image was Black. Nobody said anything. Nobody said anything with these images, but the message resonates and it settles in. Here are two screenshots from the same news program on March 23rd, 2015. Early in the program, it was reported that 3 University of Iowa wrestlers had been arrested with charges of burglary. And there are their photographs. Fine, upstanding looking, young, white men. And then about 12 minutes later in the broadcast, there was an article, an item on the Coralville police arresting 4 other people in burglary investigations. So I don't know, perhaps there's some presumption of innocence or guilt that gets reflected in the images. Nothing is said. And of course, they don't show up next to each other. So if you're not paying a whole lot of attention, you may not remember what the 3 young wrestlers look like. But the messaging is perpetual, is continuous. And so all of this comes about in ways that we are inundated by messaging. And then there's what our parents say, and it's what our friends say, and it's the term that our neighbors might use, or we're bombarded by messaging, and everyone we meet has varying degrees of prejudice, of bias, and varying degrees of willingness to articulate it, to be intentional about it, or even unintentional. And so what happens to each of us automatically, unintentionally, is that we develop what's called implicit bias. It's not conscious, it's just there because of the messaging. So this class that I took, they began by asking the white participants to list the words that they think of when they think of Black people. And they were going to write them on a chart pad. So they said to the 20 of us, so what words do you think of when you think of Black people? And there was stunned silence for a while. And then finally, one of us said exotic. Oh, okay, I wrote that down. What else? Athletic. Okay, good. Musical. Jazz. Rhythm. Dancer. Okay. What else? Can't think of much. Oh, they said, we're sorry, we didn't give you the right instructions. We didn't want you to tell us what you think of Black people. We wanted to tell us what you've heard. So we filled 11 chart pad pages with murderer, rapist, welfare, cheater, violent, criminal, 11 chart pad pages with an occasional neutral or positive word, but overwhelmingly negative. And then they said to the two Black deponents, so what words come to mind when, what do you think? What have you heard about white people? And they filled almost a chart pad page, and it was condescending, entitled, privileged. And then they said to the white people, what do you think about that list? And we white people said, well, I'm not privileged, my family was really poor, and I'm not condescending. I treat everybody this, and okay, fine. And we're having this conversation, and I am looking, they put the 11 chart pad pages up on the wall, and I am looking around at those pages, and I'm thinking, what must it be like to leave your house every morning and go out into a world that at one level or another applies those words to you? What would it feel like to me to go out in the world and know that when people see me, the color of my skin, those are the words that come to mind? I have a friend, Al, lives now in Greenville, South Carolina. I may have mentioned him before. He is the one, I think I told you that if he's working on a project in his house and he's in shorts and a t-shirt and whatever, if he needs a part from the hardware store, he will put on chinos and a polo shirt to go, because he doesn't want to confirm people's perhaps idea of him as a Black man. But the other story that he tells me that's just heartbreaking is he's almost 80 years old now. And he says more and more there are days he cannot bring himself to leave the house. He doesn't know who's going to say something. He doesn't know who's going to do something, but something will happen. And he just can't deal with it. So he stays home. We know from studies that have been done, side-by-side studies, where resumes have been created with the identical background, applying for the same job, one with a white-sounding name, one with a Black-sounding name, and there is significantly measurable differences between who gets called back, who gets invited for an interview, whose references are checked, and who gets the job, when the only difference ends up being their race. The other thing that we know, it's certainly true of me, you say, so think about the professional people that you interact with, your doctor, your lawyer, your financial advisor, your dentist. To you white people, how many of you have professional advisors or others in your orbit who are Black? In terms of addressing implicit bias, it really requires surfacing it. And there is a tool, a mechanism that you might want to try. I recommend it. I've taken it. You can only take it once. And it's Harvard University has put this together. I think 25 million people have taken this implicit bias test. And it takes 10 or 15 minutes. And at the end, it gives you an assessment based on your responses of the degree to which you exhibit implicit bias. And it's been tested and shown to be very accurate in terms of helping to surface beliefs and stereotypes that we hold. So I encourage you to take it. It can be very illuminating, particularly for any of us who went into it thinking that we really weren't biased in any significant way. And all this to say, we need to be aware. We need to be aware of our beliefs because they impact our behaviors. And ultimately, dealing with all of this, and particularly as we look at moving forward, requires taking personal responsibility. Each of us needs to say, I recognize that I have biases. I don't want to, and I would like to move beyond them. So, what am I going to do in order to address the biases that I hold? And so, particularly to the white people here, not exclusively, but there was a particular focus for us. It is important for us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. In fact, it's necessary. It's growth. If we had it all together, all of us, none of this would be an issue. So it isn't important that we do some self-examination. It's not easy. Looking at our attitudes, looking at our behaviors, our beliefs. It's also hard to do to ourselves because there's a pretty effective self-justification system that goes on in the midst of all of this. And so it can be helpful to engage a partner in this self-examination. In addition, continuing our education, the dialogue, sharing our thoughts, having an opportunity to ask questions, to share knowledge, and particularly when we are listening to people who are different than we, whose experiences may be different than ours, to listen for understanding, not to refute, not to rebut, but to try to understand what the other person sees and experiences. And then, with that as a basis, to see what it is that needs to be done, and then ask, what can I do? Leading, ideally, for each of us to a personal commitment that says, here's what I will do to help, to make a difference. So in the case of self-examination, it means observing ourselves in situations where race is a factor. How do we feel? How are we responding? Are we comfortable with what we said? Did something seem off? Just being aware. And then reflecting on our thoughts and our feelings when we are engaged in a situation like that. Was I uncomfortable? Was I tense? Was I nervous? Was I scared? What was going on? And then monitoring our reactions, being self-aware. I have done this work for a really, really long time. And yet, 5 years ago, my husband and I were in Washington, D.C. for a long weekend, Columbus Day weekend, I think. And as we were leaving, we got a call from our cleaning lady that a giant pine tree, 120 feet tall, had fallen on our house. And it had crushed a sizable portion of the roof and damaged the ceiling. And we got home and saw the damage that had been done and contacted the insurance company and got somebody who would remove the tree. But as large as it was and the way it had fallen and interspersed itself in decks and things, it was apparent that significant additional damage might be done in trying to remove the tree. So I was very apprehensive. And I was sitting in the living room as the work began, when suddenly there was this tremendous thud and the whole house shook. And I looked out, and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. I didn't think it. I didn't converse with myself and say, how are you feeling? It happened. So being aware of those responses and then reshaping what we think, consider alternatives. And again, in all of this, engaging a partner is a great idea. Somebody else who would like to do some introspection, some work on their own. Someone that you trust, who, when they tell you that you just said something that was really unfortunate, that you will listen to them and you will respond, and take it as a positive step as opposed to a criticism. So that's the inner work. That's the attitude, belief work to try to overcome our entire history of messaging and stereotypes. In terms of continuing education, there are countless books, videos, articles, museums, classes, and discussion groups. I'll share some with you, and at the end, I'd love to hear if you have some that you would recommend. Certainly, in terms of museums, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., offers incredible educational and personal development experiences, as does the Legacy Museum and the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. Opportunities to experience in multiple media our history, because we all actually learn differently. And so these museums with their videos and their exhibits and people talking about their own experiences bring an immediacy to the issues and to the history. Some of the books that I have found particularly useful, and the list keeps changing and growing. One of the first ones I read was America's Original Sin by Jim Wallis, and it was a wonderful grounding piece. Carol Anderson, a professor of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, has written 3 books recently on the subject, White Rage, which I have mentioned before, that deals with the backlash that inevitably occurs when racial progress happens. One Person, No Vote is about voter suppression and the actions that have been taken. Her first book was written in 2014. So she wrote another version in 2018 after the 2016 elections. And her most recent book is called The Second, and it deals with issues of race and the Second Amendment. How the Second Amendment is frequently used to support and defend and justify white people using guns, but not so much Black people using guns in the same circumstances. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is intriguing. You may have read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And Isabel Wilkerson has written 2 very important books. The first, The Warmth of Other Suns, follows 3 families through the Great Migration. It's about this big, well, it's big, but well worth reading. And then her most recent book is called Caste, where she likens Americans' racial caste system to India and Nazi Germany. It's a compelling read. The Color of Law deals with all those public policy decisions made, particularly in the early 20th century, that created redlining and lack of access to public services. The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, which actually has a hopeful ending to it. She says, here are all the things that are going on, but they harm all of us. And if we were to take action, all of us, white and Black and brown, would end up with a more just and more fair society. And a more recent book, Why Does Everything Have to Be About Race? And the author, Keith Boykin, gives 25 reasons why that's true. In terms of videos, the PBS has put out a video called Race, the Power of an Illusion, because race is not genetic. It is a social construct. It is an illusion, and yet it has such power. I really recommend you watch, maybe with family members or friends with whom you'd like to engage in some learning and some conversation. It's a 2-hour program called Who We Are, a chronicle of racism in America. It's basically our 6-week class in a 2-hour video done by Jeffrey Robinson, who does a phenomenal job of surfacing many of the issues that we've been talking about. And he does it in a way that is conducive to conversation. So you might want to watch it and then see if there's somebody you know that you think you'd like to watch it with and talk about. 1619 is a video series based on the book. Deconstructing White Privilege is a short 22-minute video, and I really recommend it for white people to watch. I've watched it probably a dozen or more times, and I get something more out of it every time I watch it. There are lots of TED Talks about racism in America. And I think I mentioned during an earlier class that Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th on the consequences of that loophole in the 13th Amendment and how it is carried through our history and is so prevalent in our particularly criminal justice system today. And then Race in America is an animated video series that introduces the issues of race in a non-confrontational, intriguing kind of way. There are some excellent articles, the history of the idea of race and why it matters. The Equal Justice Initiative keeps putting out new reports. They're available. I think they used to be $4 and shipping was free. Now they're $6 and shipping is $2, but they are beautifully illustrated and incredibly well-researched books on these various topics. You can actually read them online, or you can buy your very own copy. I recommend them highly. And then back in 2014, the author Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an essay for The Atlantic called The Case for Reparations. And it's a powerful piece, one of the most powerful cases for reparations. And I recommend that to you as well. In terms of dialogue, join a discussion group, form a discussion group. The YWCA offers many opportunities to participate. Join a book group that deals with issues of race. If you might want to form a book group, or if you're already in a book group, suggest one of these books as something to be read and discussed. It's really valuable to find ways to develop cross-racial relationships. Many of us still live in a very segregated personal social world. But having meaningful cross-racial conversations is priceless, particularly for those of us who are white, who struggle to comprehend what it really is to be Black in America. And in doing that, listen for understanding. So many times when a Black person will tell a story of bias or of hurtful behavior, the white response is to deny it. No, I don't think that. I don't think that happened. I don't think they meant it. To deflect it, to defend it. Well, you don't know where they were coming from. Listen, just listen and absorb. And then, importantly, again, particularly for the white people in this group, speak up. Share what you've learned in these classes, in your readings, in the videos, in the book groups, especially when you hear people express racist comments. Think about it. Think about people you know who've said something that you have believed to be wrong or inappropriate. Very often, our response as polite human beings is silence. We don't want to rock the boat. But silence presumes agreement. And it is important, if we don't agree, that we say so. There are ways to do it. I had a boss who said, if you're facing a difficult situation, think about it out of the heat of battle ahead of time. Think about, if someone says something, what will I say? So that I don't go home afterwards, having been silent, and say, I could have had a V8. Practice what you would say. That's not my experience. I don't agree. I don't agree with that. Actually, and provide a fact if you think that would be helpful. I used to think that, but I learned or I read, I saw, and I found it really informative or helpful. But speak up. So, in addition to this personal growth, which is essential, what we know is that there is an unending list of inequities that need to be addressed, and we can't do all of it. So, think about it and decide what issue touches you. Is it voting rights? Is it criminal justice? Is it police reform, education equity, affordable housing, environmental justice, reparations? What of all of this that we've learned touches you that you would like to make a difference? And then join advocacy groups. Seek opportunities to work together with other people. A group can accomplish so much more than an individual alone. Make your voice heard in conversation, in organizational leadership. Call your representatives at the state, local, and federal level to make your voice heard. Think about personal reparations. Patronize Black-owned businesses, restaurants. Contribute to and volunteer with Black-led organizations. There are many, many advocacy groups at work in Delaware doing wonderful things and making progress personally, in the community, legislatively. Seek out these groups. You will find people wanting to do the same kind of work that you do, make the same kind of impact that you would like to make, and you can partner with others, and the progress will be that much more significant. So, what moves you? That's a foundational question. What got me off the couch was the shootings of unarmed Black men, almost all of these, by police without consequence. And I will tell you that every time I do this class and show this chart, there's a new name added, at least one. Began in 2012 with Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, a 14-year-old in a park with an air gun, Alton Sterling, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, Sweet Elijah McClain, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tyree Nichols, Breonna Taylor, and this class' new name, Sonia Massey, and hundreds and thousands more. We know their names because there's video. It's like back in the civil rights movement days when the images appeared on our TV screens. Now they're appearing on our phones or our iPads or our computers. So the question is, will your experience in this class move you? In closing, Eddie Glaude, I love listening to him talk. He is the head of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University. And he recently wrote a book about James Baldwin. And at one point, James Baldwin said that the question that he used to get from white people that he hated the most was, "So what does the Negro want?" And he responded by saying, "What do you want? You want fairness, you want justice, you want opportunity, you want safety. That's what the Negro wants." So we ask ourselves today, what is your conception of justice? Should some people be valued more than others because of the color of their skin? One of the most profound indicators of privilege is life expectancy. In October 2018, the Census Bureau created a comprehensive census tract level data set that covered nearly the entire United States population. Life expectancy is a fundamental indicator of inequality. Researchers focus on it as the broadest possible dimension of privilege because so much goes into life expectancy. The life expectancy for a child born in Centerville, Delaware, exceeds the life expectancy of a child born near East 12th Street in Wilmington by 18 years, almost 2 decades. And those two census tracts are 6 miles apart. Black people are dying because of racism, because of violence, police action, health inequity, food deserts, poverty, nutrition issues, access to health care, stress-related comorbidities, maternal and infant mortality. Is that justice? And the reality is that racism hurts every single one of us. Our country is at risk. We must act. So, what's next? Self-examination, continuing education and dialogue. See what action is possible, is needed, and make a personal commitment. And oh yes, vote. Kelly, did you have something you wanted to say?
Me?
Oh, I'm sorry. Your mute went off. I didn't know.
I just turned it off. Um, this has been an amazing class, and the realities of things that I mean, I thought I was pretty unbiased. I thought I knew pretty much everything that was going on. And I mean, not really, but you know what I'm saying.
I do. I do.
I don't know Jack, honestly. And to me, the best way to handle anything is to understand. The basis of learning anything is to understand what's going on and how it's happening and all. So this was very, very eye-opening.